I want to thank Dr. Marion, even though he hasn't arrived quite yet, for the opportunity again to present grand rounds once a year. And it seems like every year that I do something, it just so happens to deal with euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, which are problems that are not going to go away. And I hope to be able in the next hour to enlighten you on how Americans think about these issues, as well as some of the philosophical, ethical issues involved from the mind of Dr. Leon Kass. I have no conflict of interest and no disclosures, and I'd like to dedicate my talk today to Bettina Hillman. I know some of you in here remember Dr. Hillman. She came to the school in '68 and was here till '02 and retired as Professor Emeritus of Pediatric Allergy, Immunology, Pulmonology, and Cystic Fibrosis. When I worked and studied under her, I was very fortunate. She trained me to think as a scientist, and we remain in close contact even today. And I also would acknowledge Dr. Joseph Graham, a philosopher in Houston who's deceased, who trained me as a bioethicist in my graduate work. He had done his studies at Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. So today, in this hour, we have two goals: to understand, according to one survey, a Pew survey, P-E-W, how Americans view these issues. And part of the problem we'll see in the Pew study is ambiguity in language. Okay, so I'm not saying that this study is completely valid, but I think it gives us at least some ideological background. And two, to evaluate the arguments of Dr. Kass against physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. Now, we start today with these slides from the Pew Charitable Trust Foundation. About 66% of Americans say that there are situations where a patient should be allowed to die. And probably about 1/3 say that everything should always be done to save a patient's life, even if there's no hope of recovery and they're incurable. What's alarming in this survey to me is there's an increasing minority of Americans that say everything should be done. You can see on these two slides, even if the patient is incurable, in great pain, and a tremendous burden. That alarms me. And secondly, it alarms me that there is an increase in this survey in Americans who believe in a legitimate right, ethically and legally, to physician-assisted suicide. Matter of fact, you can see here, look, we're neck and neck, 47, 49% approve and disapprove. But again, part of the problem we're dealing with, you're going to see today, is the language that's used. What about if we look at the morality of this by religion? Well, we see that white mainline Protestants, 71%, 67% of Catholics, and white evangelical Protestants, 42%, say that there's a right to suicide if the patient's in great pain and there's no hope of recovery. Ironically, only 50% of Hispanics and 42% in this survey of African American Protestants would say the same. What about how much thought people have given to the issues? Those who are 75 years and older, about a quarter say, we haven't really given this much serious thought. 37% say much thought, 35% say some thought. But if you look at the bottom slide, only about 1/3 of Americans in this survey say that they've considered putting anything in writing. Again, thinking through the inevitable. 37% here who've given their own wishes for end-of-life treatment say they've thought about it a lot, 35 some, 27 not much or none. In the bottom slide, preparation for and close experiences of end-of-life issues clinically, 62% said that they've talked with someone about their wishes. 47% they've known someone in their own personal lives terminal in the last 5 years, and only about 35% have written down their wishes. Now, if we look for personal preferences at the end of life, what would they tell their physician to do in these various circumstances? 57% say that they would say, stop my treatment if there's no hope or reasonable hope of recovery. Makes sense? 35%, again, to me this is alarming. It's slightly on the rise. even if there's no hope, do everything possible. 52%, stop if it's incurable and I'm totally dependent on others. 37%, pursue all treatment even though there may be no cure and I'm totally dependent on others. Now, if we look at three circumstances clinically, the patient is suffering and in great pain. 2, they're totally dependent on others. And 3, it's hard for them to function daily. Okay? What would they tell their doctors to do given those three clinical scenarios? 32% would say stop and allow for death. 20% in this survey tell the physician to do everything. And 2%, I'm not really sure. Okay, what about by age? We see that the majority of adults over 50 years of age would say stop and allow the person to die if incurable. 42% would say that less than 30 years of age. 51% would say that in the age range of 30 to 49. Now, if we combine religion and race, okay, and we ask, what would you tell your physician if you had a disease with no hope of recovery, no hope of improvement, and there was a great deal of suffering and pain? What we see from this data is that whites were more inclined than African Americans or Hispanics to stop treatment if they were incurable or in horrible pain. African American Protestants were least inclined to tell the physician to stop treatment. Indeed, 61% of African American Protestants would say, quote, do everything possible, end quote, even if there's no hope of recovery and great pain in this particular Pew study. What about prior thought and wishes? If there's a disease with no hope of improvement and great suffering and pain, 57% stop and allow death, 35% do everything possible. Okay. Amount of prior thought. 64% in this study said that they'd given it a lot of thought, 57% some, 47% little to none. Now, if we go back now to religion and race, percent of adults who say that there are circumstances where a patient should be allowed to die versus the medical staff should do everything possible in all circumstances versus don't know. 80% of white Catholics, 76% of white mainline Protestants, and 68% of white evangelical Protestants said there are conditions where the patient should be allowed to die. However, 66% of Hispanic Catholics, 54% of African American Protestants said, quote, we would want the medical staff to do everything possible in all circumstances. Now, if we break down these issues by age, we see that those who are 18 to 29 years of age, 54% would say allow the patient to die if incurable and no hope of recovery. 43%, age 18 to 29, would say, in this study, do everything possible. But note that as the age increases significantly, even more say allow the person to die, and fewer say do everything possible in all circumstances. Proxy. What if the person themselves is in a coma or a vegetative state or non-responsive? 78% said that the closest family member should be the proxy, the person to decide. What if we have an infant with a very severe life-threatening disease? 57%, ironically, would say give as much treatment as possible. 38% would say that the parents have a right to refuse treatment for the infant. What about laws in our country on physician-assisted suicide? Today we're going to talk, after I finish these slides in just a moment, about various states and cases before the courts and the United States Supreme Court. Okay? 47%, again, approve laws in our country, where 49% oppose laws on physician-assisted suicide. We come back here, looking here at religious categories here. We see that about 55% of Catholics would approve laws on physician-assisted suicide, about 61% of white mainline Protestants would. And then when we look at the morality of suicide, We see that about 62% of Americans in this survey said, we believe in it if there's great pain and no hope of recovery. 56%, yes, if incurable. 38%, yes, if a burden and ready to die. Now, looking back and looking forward, the question was asked, is life better today than it was 10 years ago? Top slide. Those who were 18 to 49 years of age, 66% said yes. Those who were 75 and older, only 3% said yes. Now, bottom slide, looking ahead. What about 10 years from now? Do you predict or hypothesize life will be better? Those 18 to 49, 71% said yes. Those 75 years of age and older, only 19% said yes. Now, let's look at some of the factors or motives or intentionalities that affect how people in our country think. What are the most important things in Americans' lives for whether to continue treatment, not continue it, ask for assisted suicide, etc.? These qualities that you see in this slide right up here are ranked hierarchically from most important to least important. So let me just mention each one. First and most important, talking, being able to feed self, followed by enjoyment, being able to live without horrible pain, having a long-term memory, followed by feeling a sense of worthwhile, being able to dress oneself, and last on the list was a short-term memory. What is important for a good quality of life? Again, this is the bottom slide right here. Communicating and talking, feeding self-enjoyment, not having severe pain, long-term memory, worthwhile, dress self, short-term memory being ranked least. So this gives us at least perhaps a basis of an ideological background from only one survey that was done about 2 years ago. Now, Leon Kass is to me a wonderful scholar. For 01 to 05, President George W. Bush asked him to chair his National Bioethics Council. Every president since Clinton was the first to start a National Bioethics Council. And every president up through Obama has formed their own council of scholars around the world in virtually every field of medicine, philosophy, law, and theology. And so from 01 to 05, Kass chaired that. He is an MD PhD. His PhD is in biochemistry. He has chaired the committee of the great classical books and thinking at University of Chicago. And I was very privileged to be asked by Dr. Kass to provide testimony in Washington in 02 before his council when I was a doctoral student at Catholic University. And he has really published extensively and very thoughtfully, I think, from largely a philosophical perspective on these issues. So now turning to some of his works and his writings, many times today we've been hearing for a while this right to die. And so, Kass wants to dissect the terminology and the language, both legally and philosophically, of this so-called right to die. We've got the Hemlock Society. We've got various organized groups that have formed, that have been around for quite a while, that are activists that are pushing this, both privately and on the public forum. And one of the problems that Kass brings out is asking, what is the basis of rights in general, and what is the basis of this so-called right to die? Probably one of the first cases we actually saw was in the mid-70s, Karen Ann Quinlan. I don't have that on the slide, but the first big case on Quinlan was out drinking and probably consumed benzodiazepines and had 2 cardiorespiratory arrests followed by ineffective mouth-to-mouth CPR and ended up in a vegetative state. The Quinlans were Catholic. They were in New Jersey. She was on a ventilator. The parents got involved. They went to the court and petitioned the court to turn the ventilator off. The court finally granted that, and wouldn't you know, she breathed on her own. And of course, then they had to make decisions regarding a PEG tube, IVs, etc. So really, Quinlan was the big one. But then around '88, Nancy Beth Cruzan in Missouri was driving a car and somehow lost control of the car and was ejected from the car. Quinlan ended up in a vegetative state in Missouri and was on a PEG tube. And so everybody ended up fighting on that, and basically the courts got involved there. And basically the court was asking one question in Cruzan. And that question was, is it reasonable, or should it be required based on reasonable evidence, that the person who's in a vegetative state had communicated some type of specific wish to have a therapy disconnected if they be in that state? Okay? And basically, the court argued, yes, that is reasonable. There should be some type of communication, maybe not necessarily writing, but something that's reasonable and credible to terminate a treatment. And so what happened in Cruzan was the PEG tube was removed, and Cruzan died just about 2 weeks after that. Now, fast forward to 1997, Washington versus Glucksberg, Vaco versus Quill. In '97, Dr. Harold Glucksberg in Washington State, with other physicians and 3 terminally ill patients, I believe 1 or 2 had AIDS and 1, I think, may have end-stage COPD, petitioned the court for the constitutional right to physician-assisted suicide. Okay? It made its way to the United States Supreme Court. About the same time in New York, Dr. Timothy Quill and other physicians did the same, okay, on behalf of their patients. Both cases ended up in the United States Supreme Court, and interestingly, both were adjudicated 9-0, not in favor of a constitutional right to physician-assisted suicide. However, the language of the court was very clever, if you will, very savvy, and left the door open for there to be more discussion and dialogue and ultimately adjudication in the courts, but also sort of, as Justice Scalia would say, throwing it back to the state legislature, in a sense. Let's let the legislators put ballots up, let people go and vote, and then let them decide based on that, and then it can work its way through the court systems. So, the very first thing that we see is Oregon, and our country was the first to have a referendum that legalized physician-assisted suicide. Montana, Vermont, Washington State. Interesting, the best of my knowledge, California just passed it, but physicians are challenging it as of a week ago in the courts in California. Okay? So these are the states that to some degree allow it now. Okay? Referendums have been on ballots in New Mexico and Colorado. We don't know what's going to happen there because there will also, often be a judicial challenge. But Oregon has provided us, if you will, sort of a laboratory of study to understand, based on the law that was passed, how it was supposed to work. So we'll be talking about some of that today, as well as the Netherlands and Holland, where it's been legal for over 20 years. The Netherlands probably gives us the largest laboratory of study, if you will, where it's regularly practiced. Physicians know they will not be penalized. They seem to be fairly good in completing data and surveys. When we talk about this issue of rights today, one of the first things is to try and clarify, Dr. Kass says, what we mean by rights. And in Kass's understanding, the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes was probably the first to discuss the notion of rights. I may be at liberty to do all sorts of things, but that doesn't mean, as Kass argues, that I have a right to do so. Even the decriminalization of a once forbidden act does not yet automatically translate into a right, even not even if I can give reasons for doing it. So in Kass's mind, the freedom to take my life does not automatically equate with the right to take my life. A true right would be at least a blameless or permitted liberty, at best a praiseworthy, even a rightful liberty, to do or not do something without anybody interfering or opposing. The rhetorics of claiming rights, which are in principle absolute and unconditional, performs an important defense in our society and in fact the common good. Okay? Rights are asserted to protect. Liberties are there to protect. Rights defend the safety and dignity of persons against a tyrannical government, a tyrannical king, or just zealot fanatics that are attempting to force their view, be it religious or whatever, upon others. So there is, in Kass's mind, described by the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, a legitimate notion of rights. Kass goes on to say, for example, there are many good things that I may rightfully possess and enjoy, but it doesn't necessarily mean I have a claim to them if they're lacking. It goes without saying that the mere assertion of a claim or the stipulation of a right is insufficient to establish it. So rights, though, seem to entail obligations. One person's right, whether to non-interference or some entitled good or service, necessarily implies another person's obligation. So it will, in our talk today, be important to understand how this so-called right to die doesn't necessarily entail the obligation of a physician or a medical professional or another to assist in killing the patient at their request. What if it, in fact, would be against their own personal conscience? We're now sort of looking at a commensuration or a balancing of rights, okay, among various individuals in the state and the common good. Because we know that in a legitimate democracy, one of the first roles of the state in the common good is to protect the lives of its innocent persons. Okay? When that doesn't happen, most of us would recognize that some form of oppression or tyranny or totalitarianism seems to be in motion, right? I mean, if I'm innocent in doing my part, the state should protect my right not to be killed unjustly. But now we have medical treatments that keep people alive for extended periods of time. Ventilators, dialysis, feeding tubes. And Kass is very right, in my view, when he says here, for example, that keeping people connected to these apparatuses when there's no hope of recovery or no reasonable hope of recovery doesn't make sense. And we're not saying that that's euthanasia, or we shouldn't be saying that, okay? Or we shouldn't be saying that that's killing. That's appropriately, in Kass's mind, letting die, letting go, as tough and as difficult as it may be. But the problem is one not just in language. Granted, that's involved, but it's a deeper problem that transcends or goes beyond language. Here, the right to die by the Hemlock Society, by Compassion in Death and Dying, by the Euthanasia Society, and there are multiple other ones, embraces a right to a lethal injection, an overdose of pills, either written on a script by one's MD or administered by one's physician. It would better be labeled, by language, Kass says, a right to force another to cooperate with my request to be mercifully killed. In other words, what this so-called right to die really means is a right to become dead, demanding your assistance if that's the only way I can see to get it done. Now, Kathleen Foley, who is a colleague of mine at Sloan Kettering Memorial in New York, Foley is professor and attending of neurology, pharmacology, palliative care, and pain management, is certainly one of the experts in the world on these issues and has published extensively. If you want to read about Oregon in particular, look up Foley. She's done incredible work trying to understand these issues. And one of the points that Foley emphasizes that Kass agrees with is there is a world of difference between killing and letting die. This is where the confusion is today, okay? People have somehow translated or equaled turning off apparatuses like a mechanical ventilator, a feeding tube, or dialysis when it no longer offers reasonable hope of recovery or any recovery as being equal to a lethal overdose. And really the courts, and particularly the United States Supreme Court, was dealing with that issue. Are these the same actions? And essentially, to some degree, the court was saying no, that people have a legitimate interest that the state recognizes in stopping unreasonable treatments that are too burdensome. In bioethics, we would call that extraordinary. If the burden outweighs the benefit, classical moral philosophy would say that's extraordinary, it's futile, we don't do it. And if the family keeps insisting, then we work with them, right, pastorally and clinically, to gently move them to trying to let go. Okay? At least that's how things work. But today, that same action is being equated with, well, how is it any different than if you write me a prescription and I take it? And the intent of the physician prescribing knows it will be used for an act of suicide. You know, one of the problems Foley brought out at Sloan Kettering in her research was one of the methods used in the state of Oregon. I'm trying to remember. It seems to me it was 9 grams of barbiturates. I hope I'm quoting that right, followed by a small glass of brandy. And Foley noted in about 20% of those cases, after 2 hours, the patient was still living. And the family was just going nuts. I mean, it tortures the family. And Foley published that in that 20% of cases, it led to family members so frustrated that they took pillows and garbage bags and choked them to death. Now, the point Foley's bringing out, and I agree with her, and Kass too, that is not death with dignity. Surely we can find a better way. Now, Foley is adamant that probably the 2 most difficult cases you physicians deal with in palliative care and pain would be metastatic cancers in the bone and Lou Gehrig's. And I know here in our community in Shreveport, just in the last year, I've known several people personally that have suffered and died from Lou Gehrig's. And it is not, as you well know, an easy death. But Foley maintains that no one today has to die a death in unbearable pain. We have the narcotics and the opioids where no one now has to do so. Now, does that mean every physician has the proper training? She says absolutely not. But we're at a crossroads now of training medical students and residents and fellows to either learn pain management palliative care, to quote Kathleen Foley, or learn to become killers. And Foley opts for the first one. So does Kass, and so do I. That would be a true, authentic sense of a good death with dignity, keeping a person as comfortable as possible. Sometimes that may mean titrating them to an unconscious state. That is rare. I've had several cases. There was a brother priest whose father was at MD Anderson who called me dying of it seems to me it was a blastic plasmacytoid dendritic cell neoplasm. It took me hours to find that on the internet, but his lungs were filling up with fluid, and it was pitiful. And so the question, was asked, can anesthesia titrate him to unconsciousness? Absolutely. I mean, no one in classical moral philosophy or theology would disagree with that. I mean, no one should have to experience, a sensation of drowning in their lungs. And he was titrated to a state of unconsciousness, and from everything we could observe, died a peaceful death. So today, when we talk about liberties and rights, we're in a situation of really asking and looking at cooperation. The involvement of other persons on various levels, from the physician all the way down. One of the things that I'd like to emphasize too, from Kass and Foley, is we know that probably 99.6 to 99.7% of people that make a sustained request for assisted suicide are suffering from, quote, a major undiagnosed psychopathology, end quote. Now, what that means to me as a moral theologian and bioethicist is that their level of moral or psychological freedom, I would highly suspect, is severely diminished, if not extenuated. Okay? Meaning I would tend to think that they're not operating as a free, rational agent. Okay? Foley goes on to say that the single most important predictive risk factor for requests for death, while there are multiple ones that correlate statistically, is depression. And in her survey of physicians in the state of Oregon, she found that most physicians who were not psychiatrists in Oregon, okay, could not easily determine if a person from a simple visit was clinically depressed in making their request for assisted suicide. Okay? She also found that psychiatrists in Oregon that went in could not pop in and out of a room one time and adequately determine from one quick, simple visit if the patient was truly clinically depressed. But what she also argued was that when patients make this request known to physicians that they want to end their life, they are describing in language as profound as they know how the horrible agony that they are in. And they're telling physicians that without relief that they would rather die. And she says when physicians will spend the time listening to that suffering that may be physical and or psychological and or existential and or psychosocial, and those needs of the patient are addressed, and that takes time and effort, okay, properly addressed, that desire for death usually subsides. When the needs of the patient are not thoroughly and profoundly addressed, the patient, Foley argues, usually dies in a state of unrecognized terror. So, what are some of the other factors of why people who are behind a right to die, what are they? Fear of being hooked up to apparatuses for extended periods of time that torture them, fear of living too long and becoming unable to care for oneself at all and being totally dependent and a burden on others, feeling a sense of a loss of dignity or degradation by senility and dependence, and somehow feeling that a right to death with dignity through assisted suicide would be better. The fear of loss of control, not only of one's bowel and bladder functions, but the loss of control psychologically. The fact that, we may not know ourselves or those around us every time someone comes in the room. And again, something we want to talk about today that's so important, a notion of autonomy. Autonomy is a very important philosophical word. I think, Dr. Merriam, when you gave grand rounds, you mentioned the 4 key precepts. I saw you on YouTube. Autonomy, beneficence, maleficence, justice. And, as Americans in the West, we cherish autonomy, right? Each of us have a freedom and autonomy to choose our careers, to choose who we want to marry or not marry, to choose if we believe in God, to choose if we go to church. Those are matters that legitimately are left with the individual and his or her sense of rightful autonomy. But what Kass and Foley are going to argue, and I believe correctly and show us today, is in the West, this notion of autonomy has become distorted. It's become exaggerated and grounded in a form, if you will, of rugged individualism, which almost oftentimes results in strong egos or strong or weak egos fighting where might prevails over those who have nothing. And so, we see so many examples today of people, again, claiming all sorts of rights not just the right to die, but all. And so philosophers and theologians ask, as Kass is, okay, what is the origin of this right? And what Kass is attempting to argue today is, and it goes back to Thomas Hobbes and to another English philosopher I'm going to discuss briefly, John Locke. Properly speaking, philosophically, rights are grounded in nature, okay? And should be in accord with proper reason. What does that mean? It means that we can observe by reason alone that we have these impulses, Kass argues, within our being, within our human nature, okay? Impulses that are spontaneous toward life, toward the pursuit of good, toward the pursuit of knowledge. You know, when you're doing research here and you're trying to understand a complex molecular phenomenon, there's human nature right there. As human beings, we have this drive, this impulse within us, within our nature, within our essence, to pursue the truth, whether it's molecular truth, medical, scientific, philosophical, or theological. And we recognize when we come together like for grand rounds that we want to share our experiences in that. And so when we look at the notion of rights, Kass cites Professor Harvey Mansfield, who was in law and government at Harvard. And Mansfield at Harvard says, rights are given to people by nature, but they're needed because people are subject to nature's improvidence. Since life is in danger, our equal rights would be to life, liberty, that which protects life, pursuit of happiness, with which life or tenuous life is occupied. But in practice, the pursuit of happiness will be, he says, the pursuit of property, for even though property is less valuable than life or liberty, it serves to guard them. Quite apart from the pleasure of being rich, having secure property shows that one has liberty secure from invasion either by the government or by others. And secure liberty is the best sign of a secure life. Because death, Kass argues, my extinction, is the evil whose avoidance is the condition of the possibility of any and all of my other goods, my right to secure my life against death, that is, my rightful liberty to self-preservation and conduct, is the bedrock of all other rights and of all politically relevant morality. Now, you know, Kass is looked at a number of other philosophers, and the other one I want to mention briefly with regard for time is the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that one cannot deprive oneself of personhood as long as one speaks of duties. And Kant's ethics was based on a duty-based type of ethic. Though one ought to have the authorization to withdraw from all obligation, to be free to act as if no authorization at all were required involves a contradiction. To destroy the subject of morality in his own person is tantamount to obliterating from the world, as far as one can, the very existence of morality itself. But morality is, nevertheless, an end in itself. So accordingly, in Kant's eyes, a philosopher, to dispose of oneself as a mere means to some end of one's own liking is to degrade the humanity in one's person, which after all was entrusted to one to preserve. So, since the time of these philosophers, we've seen, again, as I've mentioned, in Kass's view correctly, a redefining or a re-understanding of the notion of autonomy, which in itself is a valid notion. But now, Dr. Kass argues, autonomy has come to mean doing whatever I please, and that I can even choose to force your complicity or cooperation in my act of my notion of autonomy. Now, Leon Kass says there are three problems with the distorted notion of autonomy based on rugged individualism. One, he says one can't establish on this basis a right to have someone else's assistance in committing suicide. A right, by the way, that it would impose an obligation on you and thereby restrict your autonomy. Two, even if my choice for death were reasonable and my assistant were chosen freely, my autonomy cannot ground his right to kill me, and hence cannot ground my right to become dead. And third, Kass argues a liberty right to an assisted death, can at most approve assisted suicide or euthanasia for the mentally competent and those who are mentally alert, a restriction that would then prohibit affecting the deaths of the mentally incompetent or comatose who've left no explicit instructions regarding their treatment. Then at this point, Dr. Kass switches to the 19th century philosopher some of you may have heard of, Friedrich Nietzsche, again another brilliant philosopher who basically subjectivized truth and carried it to another extreme, that there was no objective notion of truth at all. Now, when we go back to this notion of autonomy, and we recognize these cases that we've looked at today, Quinlan, Cruzan, Glucksberg, and Baco, we recognize that certainly as a country, and there are other countries in addition to ours in the around the world, are struggling to understand this so-called right to assisted suicide based upon autonomy and a sense of rugged individualism. And it was interesting that when the Supreme Court in '97 issued its 9-0 vote, saying, that the due protection clause and so forth, the 14th Amendment do not establish a constitutional right for assisted suicide. Rehnquist, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in particular, had used language in their writing of their opinions that sort of skirted some of the issue, thereby leaving the door legally open so that the courts at various levels could revisit these cases. And O'Connor herself, as Dr. Kass points out, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, did not seem to want to deal with the narrower question, and that question was this: whether a mentally competent person who is experiencing great suffering has also a constitutionally cognizable interest in controlling the circumstances of his or her own death. Because as we're going to see in just a moment, when we look at a detailed study of the practice of assisted suicide in the Netherlands, we're going to see some data that will show us how it began, and over a period of more than 20 years, what it has tragically often evolved into. So, when we talk about this right to die, in Dr. Kass's mind, there are three dangers that Leon Kass wants us to ponder and think about. The first one is that the right to die, especially as it comes to a right to have assistance or aid in dying from a physician or the medical staff, comes to embrace euthanasia, will translate over time into an obligation of others to assist. And based on other issues, which we won't get into right now, Kass says it will likely be that those who refuse to assist will be labeled as intolerant and violating the autonomy of the person requesting assistance in assisted suicide. 2, Kass says the danger of a so-called right to die is there can be no way to confine it to those who knowingly and freely request death. We'll see that in just a moment in the empirical data in the Netherlands. The vast majority of persons who are candidates for assistance will increasingly be incapable of choosing and effecting a course of action for themselves. No one with an expensive, troublesome illness or pathology will be safe from having pressure exerted upon them to exercise their right to die. And that's putting it nicely. And thirdly, the medical professions, and this to me is probably one of the most important, the medical profession's devotion to heal and refusal to kill, which Kass says is at the very ethical center of a physician's practice, will be permanently destroyed, and with it, patient trust and physician self-restraint. Here is another case where acceding or acquiescing to such a punitive personal right will wreak havoc on the common good. Now, nothing that Kass is saying, and he says this himself very explicitly, is meant to say that all treatments and apparatuses should be continued in all circumstances. I find his reasoning very balanced, that when these treatments do not offer any hope of recovery or a reasonable hope of recovery, or the burden clearly outweighs the benefit, that they should be stopped and would be rendered ethically extraordinary. Now, let's look for a little bit here at the practice of euthanasia in Holland. This has been going on for about 20 years in Holland. And this data here comes to you from Dr. Richard Finisken, MD, PhD in Holland, who is a retired cardiologist. He has monitored this and published extensively in Issues in Law and Medicine, because what we found from all this data, where it's been going on for over 20 years, is that there were very strict committees that were set up in Holland, that when a patient made a request, to a physician, they had to appear before a committee. The physician had to consult with another physician. There had to be a psychiatric evaluation. Everything, according to the Dutch protocol, was to be very tightly regulated, just as we were told it would be in Oregon, And what we have seen happen in the Netherlands, if you look at this data here, you can see that with lethal injections administered upon request in 90, there were about 2,300. And what this process has slowly evolved into since it began over 20 years ago. And you can see right here, the active involuntary euthanasia, lethal injections, lethal overdoses of opioids or narcotics with the intent to cause death without the patient's knowledge or consent. This is a very significant problem. When this data first came out, many scholars were horrified, and then physicians who knew that they were granted immunity in Holland, that they would not be prosecuted, which is probably a fairly good motive to answer the surveys honestly, if you know there are no repercussions, admitted that they were cutting corners. Many times they admitted they did not consult with the second MD. Many times they admitted there was no psychological or psychiatric evaluation. And then many times they admitted that they were administering lethal doses not only to keep the patient comfortable, but to accelerate, to hasten the process of death. Now, in classic moral philosophy, we have the principle of double effect, which goes back to probably the 13th century. And double effect essentially would recognize, many facets of bioethics, but let's restrict it for right now to the purpose of alleviating pain in a very difficult case, maybe a metastatic cancer to the bone or Lou Gehrig's. Sort of like my brother priest's father friend at MD Anderson. If the only way to bring relief is to slowly increase the titrations, such that once you get them comfortable, you don't keep increasing. No philosopher or theologian would disagree with that I've ever read. But the problem we're seeing in Holland, and perhaps other places, is that the patient is titrated to a state of comfort, but because of other pressures of the family in grave existential distress, watching the loved one die, economic pressures, Medicaid, Medicare, insurance, tied up beds, whatever. In Holland, at least, we have ample empirical data that once the patient is titrated to a level of comfort, it's increased to accelerate the process. This, I believe, while being unethical, describes what euthanasia is that is problematic. And again, we've got the problem today in language, though it transcends and goes beyond language, that stopping extraordinary treatment in the courts by tradition has never been seen as giving a lethal dose. But today, and when revolutions occur, it's always stated historically that they began by changing the language, right, the vocabulary. Once you manipulate the language and redefine it, you've set an academic, theoretical center for a revolution to change the way people think and the way they evaluate ideas. So this study in the Netherlands probably is the most comprehensive one that's been done in the world for over 20 years and really shows us that the way the system was supposed to work is not how it always plays out in real life. So, in conclusion today, Dr. Kass would support this, and I would agree with him. Going back to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, if we could somehow figure out a way to go back to an objective notion of rights grounded in human nature and the virtues. And by the virtues, I'm referring to the natural moral virtues of justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. Recognizing rights grounded in human nature correlate with practical reason, forming and sensitizing consciences properly. And finally, I figured maybe it would be good to go back and find a copy of the original Hippocratic Oath. It's my understanding today that most medical schools, when seniors graduate, have various copies. And students or new physicians pick whichever one they want. I've only been into one. I've traveled the country lecturing, and I'm in many physicians' offices all the time, but I've only seen the original oath in one physician's office, and I'm glad that it was my internist here in Shreveport. Okay, thank you for your time. Questions or comments? Thank you.